As some of you know, I love the Ultimate Ninja franchise. I don't love every game there, but the ones I do, I consider them to be some of my all-time favorite video game experiences. I've talked about the last 3 PlayStation 2 games in that past video, and I think it's time to transition to the following generation, which is ironic because I played the Storm Trilogy using a PlayStation 4. I'll talk about each one of them individually, though there will be times when I'll bring up the other ones during their own individual reviews. Also, don't worry, I'll talk about Storm 4 eventually in the future. Don't know when, I just know that I will sometime. Man, Storm 1 has such a cool introductory scene, right after showing us a much more animated and atmospheric version of the opening of Hero's History or Hero Mode, followed by the title and a short scene giving us a look at how big the village is without necessarily showing us every corner of it, plus a really nice song which funny enough seems like a mix of the musical identity of the PS2 Ultimate Ninja games and the Storm games. It's safe to say this opening would have been perfect if it wasn't for one major flaw with this game, which I'll eventually address, because even though this video is meant to show my appreciation for the Storm Trilogy, that's not to say I won't share some grievances, and Storm 1, let's just say it was kind of disappointing to revisit. Now look, I like Storm 1, but it's definitely my least favorite out of the main Storm titles, which is really unfortunate because I didn't really want to feel this way. I have so much respect for what this game did for the Ultimate Ninja franchise. Now there are several changes Storm 1 offered, but the most notable one was the 3-dimensional environment during battles. Now, I am aware that not everyone will agree with me and that some people prefer traditional 2D games or Naruto's case 2.5D, but personally, I really love the 3-dimensional setting and I would take this over 2D any day. I just feel more connected to both the character I'm controlling and the fight itself, and I'm not limited to one angle. Yeah, it might make it harder to center your attacks, but I don't really see that as a downside, it just makes it more challenging. Besides, with Chakra Dash I can easily approach my opponent and just attack him, and even then when you're activating Ninjutsu it automatically targets your opponent. It just so happens that it can dodge it by moving to another direction more easily, which is a good thing actually. Plus, I'm glad they didn't split the screen during 2-player versus battles. The camera instead just automatically puts the 2 players in focus with each other. I just feel like this franchise benefits more by making the settings 3-dimensional, like having a stronger picture of your arena and being able to observe every inch of the character models as the camera rotates when they move. Neji's 8 trigram palms rotation is actually spherical this time, which is the main gist of his ability in the first place. It also makes the ninjutsu attack feel more natural, as usually when they occur, even in the PS2 games, the angle would change once or multiple times in an attempt to benefit the sequence with a different and more effective shot. With Storm 1, whenever this happens, it feels a lot more natural because the angles change quite frequently as you move with your player. On a similar subject, there's no weird flash effect before the ninjutsu sequence is activated, and when you hit your opponent with an ultimate jutsu, the game doesn't temporarily stop while a character says something right before the ultimate jutsu starts, which I won't say this was a huge problem in the PS2 games, but the fact that in Storm 1 the transition feels more natural and direct, it just makes me appreciate it more. Also, unlike in the later Storm games where whenever a player performs the clicks necessary to activate the ultimate jutsu, the game would kind of freeze for a second and the entire environment would get a bit darkened with the exception of the player who's activating it, inevitably making it obvious that his opponent is about to get his ass kicked if it doesn't dodge, even if it doesn't necessarily guarantee prevention. But in Storm 1, the only clue you have is the size and color of the blue aura surrounding their bodies, which you have to pay close enough attention if you want to avoid the hit. When back in the PS2 games, there was a circle logo on top of the player, making it apparent that he wants to activate ultimate jutsu. Not to mention, Storm 1 doesn't have that brief pause before the process of pressing a number of buttons in time so that you have an advantage against your opponent if you want to either evade him or attack him. I'm bringing all of this up because my main point is that this system makes it so the person activating the ultimate jutsu can have the upper hand if his opponent isn't paying enough attention, unlike before when it felt like the games were trying their best to put both players in even terms by giving the victim of the attack a heads up. Also, when you cancel the jutsu, it doesn't awkwardly pause the sequence, it just shows an alternative outcome that's pre-configured for every time you click the buttons in time, although it's still in black and white, which is a bit unnecessary to be honest. And finally, when it's activated, you don't get transferred to like another location or in some cases dimension. Instead, you stay in the exact same stage you chose, which is pretty nice. In terms of the changes in the controls, I personally think they were all for the best. In my previous video, I criticized the PS2 games for making the ultimate jutsu less exercising to execute than a normal jutsu, which didn't make much sense in my opinion. Why is it less convenient to launch an attack that inflicts less damage? Here they fixed this problem by pressing triangle and circle to activate ninjutsu instead of relying on arrow keys to do it, in which you're basically forced to freeze, and this issue could not exist in a game with circular movement, so they had to immediately fix it. You now have to throw alternative weapons by using arrow keys instead of pressing the L1 or R1 button who knows how many times before the weapon you want is at your disposal for an attack, so yeah, it's a lot more convenient like this. In terms of new features, there's surprisingly not that much, aside from the supporting characters, in which now you can have two instead of just one, and they can be either guard type or attack type, which will help you in final blows during either a melee combo or ninjutsu, in which they either offer a last blow or they protect you from an imminent punch from your opponent's supporting character. That's pretty much it. In fact, they ended up removing more things like reversal, directional attacks, and a second ninjutsu. You can throw a character or hold your circle button to deliver a hard blow, but with the first option, while it is pretty useful, especially because it allows me to attack my opponent when he's guarding, it's at the cost of not inflicting that much damage, and with the latter, it's almost rare for that to even happen given how it takes at least a second for your attack to get charged, and during that period, your opponent is not just gonna fuck around and do nothing, he's gonna fucking murder you if you just sit around and do nothing. They also removed both the rock paper scissors and continuous substitution thing, but I'm not gonna lie, I'm not really gonna miss either of them, so I actually count this as a positive. You can walk in walls, though it's very limited and you can't just walk in them whenever you want. It's impossible for you to be in a scenario where one character is on the ground while the other one is sticking on the wall, which is a shame because I really wanted to use Sasuke and launch a Chidori similarly to how he did against Gaara, which was literally impossible to do in the PS2 games because of the reliance on arrow keys. But unfortunately, I can't do that here either. You can activate Awakening mode without first going through Ultimate Jutsu, though your health has to go at least halfway down. Not everyone has like crazy changes, and the ones that do, you can actually choose to play with their Awakening state pre-activated with no time limit by pressing L1 doing character selection in free battle. However, when it comes to Ultimate Jutsu, only those specific characters have a special one for Awakening, while everyone else with simple awakenings only have one ultimate. And back in the PS2 games, even when you didn't have crazy awakenings, you could pull off a second or even third ultimate in specific circumstances. Though I feel like it wouldn't be fair if I didn't bring up the less gameplay driven aspects of the presentation, starting with the impressively stellar cel shaded graphics. Now look, I really don't want to downplay the PS2 games because I think they did a really good job with their graphical limitation, but Storm 1 shits on the PS2 games. It shits on every Naruto game in terms of how it looks, in terms of how beautifully polished the visuals are, and honestly, I can't think of that many anime-based games that do a better job than the Storm games when it comes to replicating its source material. Though Dragon Ball FighterZ is up there, if not better to be honest, and the upcoming Kill la Kill game looks pretty dang promising. In the later titles, you eventually get accustomed to explosive spectacle, but because this game is based on part 1, you'll get exposed to more grounded combos, and the shit some of the characters can do with their taijutsu skills is pretty dope. I will say that Storm 1 has the least refined graphics, and during dialogue sequences, there are a couple of shots and movements that you can kind of nitpick if you really want to, but they are greatly overshadowed by the sheer greatness of the game's visual presentation in every other area. In terms of music, it's a bit difficult for me to explain the difference between this game and the PS2 games because I'm not exactly much of a music critic, so I'm gonna try my best to share what I've observed. Earlier on, like very early, the soundtrack for the Ultimate Ninja games had a certain pattern. In general, the tracks had a pretty traditional feel to them, as they were heavily reliant on traditional Japanese instruments, though much like in the anime, at least in part 1, it also occasionally tried to have this sort of hip-hop layer to its tempo, and when it came to battle music, they tried to simultaneously implement a more classic fighting game vibe mixed with its traditional Japanese edge. Not every stage was strictly like this, but this was the tendency they had. Now, as the games kept getting released, they were evolving beyond these patterns, and by the time we reached Ultimate Ninja 5, the tone of the music felt more similar to Storm 1, especially when it came to the pacing of the melody and the way the guitar was played. Though what makes this game and the entire series as a whole more distinct from the PS2 games is the way they implemented the piano. Before, it used to be that the piano was only used in dramatic scores, but now the instrument is taking advantage in order to create various other atmospheres, like how in the main menu the piano adds this sort of jazzy vibe to the music. There are other distinct changes, like how they use traditional Japanese flutes and the identity each series of games had based on how they were used, but I don't want to sound like a fucking dimwit more than I probably already do, since I don't have that much experience talking about music critically, so you're just gonna have to take my word when I say that the music in the Storm games is a lot like the ones from the previous platform, but also does some things a tad bit differently. Regardless, both series offered some pretty great stuff, and Storm 1 definitely has some sick ass tracks like the opening theme, the tuning exams preliminaries and finals, Sorrowful Eyes, and my personal favorite, Training Field. All of them are some of the finest video game tracks I've ever heard. Now, given how I started off the video by expressing how Storm 1 is my least favorite of the trilogy, I think it's only a matter of time before someone starts asking when exactly I'm gonna start shitting on this game, given how all I've been doing throughout this entire video is sucking Storm 1 off. But like I said before, I like the damn game, but what ultimately brings it down for me is Ultimate Mission. I felt very disappointed when I found out that the game really didn't go all out with adapting part 1 of Naruto the same way the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th did. It really did gloss over a lot of really important plot elements and even completely removing an entire arc. Zabuza and Haku are completely absent. This really left me on a sour mood. The Land of the Waves is my favorite arc of part 1, so it upsets me that it didn't even bother to include bits of it. Well, I guess aside from the Genin training, I have two theories for why this happened. The first one is probably the least likely, which is that 80% of the PS2 games adapted part 1 of Naruto, so they didn't feel the need to focus that much on the story, and instead they felt like they should have focused on what they could do with the new platform and just kind of skim through the story and pick moments they felt would add to the game experience. My second theory, while still very speculative and presumptuous, I really wouldn't be surprised if this is the reason why, which is that the market they were aiming influenced their actions. Now, the PS2 games were primarily targeted and created for Japanese audiences, clearly by how it would take roughly 2 years for them to be ported to the West, and well, they are Japanese games, but Storm 1 was the first Ultimate Ninja title that had Western audiences in mind, evident by how it only features characters from part 1, even though Shippuden had already started airing around that time in Japan, and also by how it was released in the West before Japan got a hold of it. In fact, I even heard that what made them finally release in Japan was public demand. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because there's an interview where Hiroshi Matsuyama admitted to a misconception he used to have, which was that Western audiences don't really care about story in video games and care a lot more about the gameplay. So if this is true, it would be safe to assume that they probably attempted to make Ultimate Mission appealing to the Western crowd by enhancing the gameplay experience and not focus too much on the story. And in the game's defense, it has probably the best free roam in all of the Storm games. The stuff you can do here isn't even comparable to what you're limited to in the later titles, and while I think Rise of Ninja has a better map, it is very fun to fuck around in the village. It reminds me a lot of the free roam in Ultimate Ninja 3, but with far better features and detail in the mapping and architecture. Though at the end of the day, I don't feel very confident saying that Ultimate Mission is the better option because Ultimate Contest just feels livelier. One thing I really wish they hadn't removed was the voice acting. They really did underestimate just how adding voices to the dialogue, even if you were just talking to random villagers, made the experience a lot better and the world feel more real. But it's not just that, I really don't like the structure in Ultimate Mission. If you want to advance the main storyline, which is already heavily skimmed through, you have to accumulate XP points, which, alright, fair enough, but in order to do that, you have to do these side missions that are completely inconsequential and just basically interrupt the story. This really did ruin the flow and made the experience really tedious. It reminded me a lot of Heroes 2, though I will give credit to Storm 1 and say it wasn't like nearly that bad. But hey, you could argue it's the same deal with Ultimate Contest. You have to do these little side and debatably inconsequential missions in order to advance the story. but the difference here is that the missions in Ultimate Contest are closely tied in with the main story and they don't necessarily interrupt it. Also, that mode isn't exactly plot driven. Yeah, there's a clear narrative if you pay close enough attention, but it's not exactly heavily reliant on the plot. Story 1, however, is basing their mode off of the story of part 1 of Naruto, which is in fact plot driven. Now, I know some people will probably defend this decision by saying that Storm 1 is primarily a video game. If you want to experience the story of Naruto, then go fucking read the manga or watch the anime. Now, I have two counter arguments for that. For starters, just because it's a video game, it doesn't mean it can't be utilized as a storytelling medium. I'm not even asking them to include literally every narrative detail of part 1. I mean, Ultimate Ninja 5 didn't include everything about the arcs it was adapting. There were several things they left out, like the fact that Sasuke chose to spare Naruto's life because he didn't want to follow his brother's footsteps, which meant activating the Mangekyo Sharingan by killing someone close to him. That wasn't even brought up in the game. Sasuke just said it was his temper that saved him. But I don't really care that much because the game included the right information needed to experience the core emotions those arcs attempted to offer, and that's enough for me, which brings me to my second point, which is that the Ultimate Ninja games have proven that they can do a great job adapting its source material. I'm not judging Storm 1 based on some unreasonable and imaginary standards I pull out of my ass. I criticize it because I know they could have done better based on their history. I mean, if they didn't want to pull the same stunt they did in Ultimate Ninja 4 and 5 and the later story games, then why even bother basing it off of part 1 of Naruto? Why even bother including the story if it's just gonna be trimmed down? I've seen mobile games that do a better job than this. Probably the most frustrating thing about this is that there were moments where I would in fact get hyped up, specifically doing boss battles with Gamabunta, Fukaku, and Manda. Those were really great experiences, and even the last clash between Naruto and Sasuke, which wasn't exactly a boss battle, still had dialogue that served as build-up for the fight, which made it a lot more tense than any of the fights that came before it, minus the ones I mentioned of course. I honestly feel bad for shitting on Hero's history. That mode actually had better build-up before the fights than Ultimate Mission did. It's just really annoying how there aren't that many Ultimate Ninja games that do part 1 justice to the point where I have to recommend Rise of Ninja and Broken Bond if you want the best storytelling experience. If I have to share any issues I have with the gameplay, I don't like how you don't have the option to exclude supporting characters. This was also a problem in Ultimate Ninja 5, by the way. The game is occasionally not very responsive and there are some other minor problems I have, but they're mostly a result of me being used to the later titles that tweak the mechanics. The controls are a little bit shallow, which, I mean, granted, you could maybe argue that the franchise as a whole has simplistic controls, but I think Storm 1 is to the point where it doesn't feel like you're exercising your brain as much as you could have, and it also feels repetitive when you're constantly relying on Circle to damage your opponent. The PS2 games also relied on Circle, arguably more than Storm 1, but I feel like the nature of those games allowed them to be more competitive, like with how unique the combos, mini segments, and jutsu each character had, which is another thing you'll notice while playing this game. The melee attacks tend to be more or less the same with each individual character, specifically when it comes to which direction you're aiming the analog. Yeah, it's only after a couple of hits that the difference between each combo can be seen. I feel like as the years passed, the controls and gameplay were tweaked little by little to the point where playing it feels more strategic and complex. But I mean, I still wish they had reversal combo, though I don't know why they removed it. Although they do have something that I guess replaces it. If your character isn't aiming at your opponent, once you adjust your position by flicking the analog, you can press circle and he'll perform a quick and exclusive attack, though the timing isn't very lenient. Actually, to be honest, I'm not even sure if this was introduced in Storm 1. Maybe it was introduced in Storm 2, but I forgot while writing the script. Overall, I would probably put this on top of Generations and Revolution, which I know some of you will really disagree with me, but I gotta give credit to Storm 1 for one thing. It has a unique enough gameplay that you can't really get from the later titles, while Generations, for example, aside from Fort Combo, there really isn't much about it that you can't get from the later ones, and Revolution is more or less the same story, plus adding a shitty system where you have to choose between Ultimate Jutsu, Awakening, and Drive type. The only thing significantly unique about those games are the game modes, which, aside from Ninja Escapades mode, they're all pretty shit. I still revisit Storm 1 because it's fascinating to experience Storm when it was at a different stage than what we're familiar with. It's interesting seeing traces of PS2 Ultimate Ninja scattered throughout this game and certain arena music I wouldn't get anywhere else, while Generations and Revolution are a lot more reminiscent of the latest stage of Storm, except they're worse inevitably since they came out first, so it's just pointless to play those games. But just so I won't piss too many people off, I will admit that if I only had one option to choose just one Storm title and I had to choose between these three games, I probably wouldn't choose Storm 1. I think I would go for Revolution for the larger roster and semi-upgraded mechanics. Nevertheless, I still have a soft spot for Storm 1, even if it doesn't represent the Storm series at its best. At the time of its release, it showed us how far we can possibly go with bringing Naruto to life in video game form in such a polished and cinematic way. However, Storm 2 showed us exactly what that looks like.
かつて死闘があった綱割りをかけ思いを超え絆を避けついに拳を交えるも友は深淵へと進みゆくされど残されし少年の意みじんも揺らぐことなく己が忍度を示すため共にその手を伸ばすため死に並び成長の旅へと立つそして幾年柔らかな日差しが照らす中一陣の優しき風がこの葉の地へ舞い戻る今まさに祭動の時来たる
Jesus Christ, I don't even know how to start this part of the video. There's so much I want to say that figuring out where to even begin is a journey in and of itself. So you know what? Fine. Let's first talk about the gameplay, and this is something I feel like is very important to bring up because back when this game was released, it started a bit of a controversy among fans of the Ultimate Ninja games, mainly due to the fact that a lot of features were removed from Storm 1. Now, I'll try to address all of them, at least ones that are relevant to me, and share my personal opinion. First one is the Jutsu class, and I'm just gonna say this is a fun feature, it really is, but it didn't always make sense. I mean, sure, Chidori and Rasengan clash makes obvious sense, but there are other ones that were questionable at best. But even if I could suspend my disbelief, honestly, I've never been in a scenario where a Jutsu clash occurred. Now, granted, I'm willing to suspect that it was probably because I was mostly playing against CPU, and if I were to fight against real people, this feature would be more useful. But I mean, I did play Ultimate Ninja 5 with my brother a lot, and I don't recall us clashing that often. It was pretty rare, and I can't think of reasons to believe this would be more reoccurring if we were to play Storm 1. On a similar subject, they removed the whole button mashing system during Ultimate Jutsu, and I'm actually pretty mixed on that. On one hand, I really like how you can actually dodge Ultimate Jutsu, and it does make the game more competitive, but at the same time, this system basically forced the sequences to be longer than they probably should have been. And look, this is obviously pretty subjective, but I appreciate the fact that in Storm 2, the Ultimate Jutsu can be as long as they need to be and are not required to be padded out in order to have enough time to engage in the button mash and witness enough action for yourself. This was even worse in the PS2 games. Like, Sasuke had an Ultimate Jutsu where he performed a sequence of kicks that isn't that different from his regular combo moves in Storm 2, though I'm willing to acknowledge that Storm 1 wasn't nearly as guilty of this problem. And look, I'll admit, there are a lot of Ultimate Jutsu in Storm 2 that are really short and not that flashy, which kinda makes them feel underwhelming. But personally, I value the significance and impact of the Ultimate Jutsu more so than how long it is. I like the fact that when you first start the game, Naruto can only perform a QB Amp Rasengan as his trump card, because that was how far he could go at the time. And then he learned Rasen Shuriken, and that became his trump card. And as the Storm games progress, the characters get stronger, which lead to their ultimate jutsu getting crazier. Seeing Naruto only perform a QB Amp Rasengan makes his eventual Biju Dama Blast even more impactful and gratifying. That's pretty much my philosophy. Moving on, you can't perform ultimate jutsu during awakening mode, and yeah, I'm not gonna defend that. I wish they had kept this function. Separate music doesn't play anymore when the characters activate the ultimates, which I'm actually glad they took it away, because switching back from one song to the other, then having to restart the default stage music, that can get very distracting, especially when both songs have completely different tones. Not to mention, given how the ultimate techniques are shorter now, it would have been completely unnecessary to insert a song in the middle of the game that would only last like, I don't know, 5 seconds or less. They didn't include characters from part 1, and honestly I'm pretty indifferent towards this. Who knows, maybe at the time I would've get pissed, but today I have like fucking Storm 3 and 4, both of which have far superior gameplay, so if I really want to play free battle or online mode, it doesn't make any sense for me to choose Storm 2. I also feel mostly indifferent towards them removing wall climbing, because I don't think this feature was well implemented to begin with. And finally, both ground smacking and strong punches, yeah, I don't give a shit about either of them because they're both useless moves. As for things Storm 2 added, oddly enough, aside from how the support drive works, there isn't much, at least ones that only apply to free battles. Where you really start to spot the improvement is when you experience the single player campaign, which I'll get into in a moment, but first I do want to highlight the fact that the movements feel more fluid and responsive than Storm 1. I'm not sure why, I just know that Storm 2 feels a lot more comfortable to play, and it's faster at reacting to my commands. They also adjusted the camera in order to cater to the taller versions of the characters, because in Storm 1, the camera was centered in a way that could match the height of primarily the kids, but the problem with this was that whenever you pick characters that, you know, weren't children, they looked like fucking giants. Kisame basically occupied the entire screen vertically. So because we reached Shippuden, they decided to tweak this little quirk since there aren't really any short characters there. They also introduced online mode, but I don't really care. What, am I supposed to pretend like I care about playing Storm 2 online in 2019 when I have Storm 4? Also, I did try to seek out players and it was depressingly deserted. But do you know what I really want to highlight? The music. Now, I don't necessarily think that Storm 2 has the best soundtrack in this entire franchise. Hell, I'm not even sure if it has the best among the Storm games. I feel like it's debatable and it warrants its own conversation. But Storm 2's soundtrack was such a landmark for what it did musically. Now, there's this common opinion among Naruto fans that Shippuden took a pretty dark direction, some even arguing that it was darker than it should have been, which I personally don't agree with the second opinion in particular. Sure, I agree it was darker than part 1, but I don't think it was significantly toned down. I do, however, fully acknowledge that there was a period during the story where the series was showing to be more mature than what we were initially comfortable with. Now, I don't necessarily think this was a bad move, but it was something that happened, and it just so happens that Storm 2 adapts that exact phase of the story. As a result, the game had to leave an impression, do something that could effectively communicate this tone shift, and they partially chose to do this through the music, specifically the main menu. Storm 2 has a pretty mellow title screen, main menu, it even somewhat got carried on to the character selection music, and the best part is, they're all interconnected. Storm 2 started the trend of blending the title screen and the main menu, both in the visual and musical department. They share the same track except the menu has additional instruments in play, but both of them are still in sync. I commend Storm 1 for having a separate character selection music, something that wasn't very frequent in the PS2 games, and the song itself was pretty badass. I would always get hyped up whenever I listened to that song. But Storm 2 decided to share the music with the one from the main menu, but with even heavier instrumentalization, and not to mention when the root of this song is this calm and sentimental piano solo, it makes the whole experience of choosing which character you'll play with for friendly battles feel very emotional, with an energetic beat and a jazzy piano sequence added in. Honestly, the calm before the storm is one of my personal favorite video game themes of all time. But you know what, let's stop cucking around, let's get to the real reason for why Storm 2 is a game I'll always treasure for the rest of my life, and it's because of Ultimate Adventure. By the way, remember that theory I had that Storm 1 had shit story because the game's target audience were Westerners? Well, Storm 2 kind of reinforces my point for the simple fact that I believe they either switched the target audience to Japanese or they stopped giving a shit and went with the direction they've been taking since the last PS2 title. Evident by how the main mode is heavily story driven, the free roam got significantly watered down in several important areas. They released it in Japan before the West, and they were adapting a period Shippuden that hadn't received an English dub yet. The shift in priorities just seems too suspicious. On the subject of Storm 1, one obstacle you'll have to deal with is the fact that the second game limited your functions during free roaming. And I'm not gonna lie, when I played Ultimate Adventure for the first time, I was really disappointed by the absence of so many features I was used to. And for the record, I wasn't even comparing it with Storm 1. I specifically had Ultimate Ninja 5 in mind, and I was pretty salty when I found out I couldn't double jump, dash, jump through anything with a smidge of higher altitude, switch leaders, rotate your camera whenever you wanted, and not just in certain locations, fucking voice actors. Now, granted, when you're playing through the story, you can listen to what they're saying. Well, in general, at least when Chie was introduced, I couldn't hear a goddamn thing she was saying. She also didn't attack Kakashi before she worked alongside Team 7, which is another thing you'll notice, the fact that they removed certain shots and bits of dialogue Ultimate Ninja 5 included that were adapted from the source material, like for example Hinata fainting. Now, granted, most of the scenes they decided to remove, both from Ultimate Ninja 5 and from the manga, didn't really damage the whole experience and weren't super important plot details that would prevent you from generating an emotional response, essential to the overall experience the original story intended you to feel. Well, except for one moment, but I'll get to that later. As for the free roaming features, look, I'm just gonna say this, I revisited the game for the purpose of reviewing it. I played it right after I semi-finished Storm 1, which has the best free roam, and I reached the conclusion that removing the features that they did weren't too detrimental. Here's the thing, the Ultimate Ninja games have a history of taking off certain features as they release more titles, and whether or not they do it because of limited resources, platform capacity, or whatever fucking excuse you can give, it's something that they do. And yes, it's kind of annoying, but it's also something you kinda just get used to it. So when I see them limiting what you can do with the open world, it seems like a case of exactly that. And the question just ends up becoming, did the removal of these features significantly affect my experience? And honestly, I don't think it did that much. Something like Storm 1 for example, so much of the game involves you exploring Konoha, like collecting ramen ingredients, scrolls, ninjutsu, unlocking missions, some of them being hide and seek and races which are heavily tied to walking through the village. Not to mention everything I brought up are crucial to finishing the Ultimate Ninja mode, so as a result, they had to enhance the free roaming experience as much as they could. Storm 2 however has somewhat different priorities. The main purpose is to tell the story of Shippuden, and they take advantage of free roaming in order to do that via travels. So the main objective was to build up a world that resembles exactly what you've seen from the anime, and they do that in a way that I initially didn't even notice that hadn't been done in the previous game to the same degree Storm 2 did, which was having the locations look 100% identical to the 2D painted backgrounds from the anime. I remember watching a video, I believe from MathWiz, and there was a point where he was talking about the fight between Naruto and Kakuzu, and while the footage of the battle was being played, all I could think was, holy fuck, I haven't even watched this episode and somehow I feel really familiar with this location. Another sort of advantage of having certain locations limited to one angle is that the game chooses the best possible one with the best view, and since moving from one location to the other is pretty fast, it doesn't feel tiresome witnessing just one view, especially when most of the time all you're doing is walking. What about that fucking amazing view of the 5 Kage statues that pans up as you advance to Tsunade's mansion? And look, I'm not trying to convince you that Ultimate Adventure has it better like this. I agree, I would have gotten a better experience if they hadn't taken away the features implemented in the past. I'm just saying that what we got in the end wasn't really that bad. Hell, I haven't even mentioned the detail added in the animation and sound design of the background characters. While playing this game, there was a certain point where I started hearing the sound of someone using a broom right before I realized it was coming from the game, and I admired the realistic sound patterns that was emitting. Should I even bring up how your supporting teammates can move their heads depending on where you're moving towards? How about the fact that I can join a 4-member team instead of 3 like in Ultimate Ninja 5? Some of the areas you can visit are nearly identical to their battle stages, which makes your transition between open world and battle even more immersive. another advantage of three-dimensional environments. And I don't think I've even begun to touch on the main reason for why Storm 2 is beloved by so many people. Can we just talk about how fucking deadass this game is at adapting Shippuden from the Kasekage rescue mission to the Pain Assault arc? It wasn't by any means the first game to do such a great job with the storytelling. Hell, 2 of the arcs including here were really well handled in Ultimate Ninja 5 and I guess half of UN 4. Which is why I'm glad they decided not to have literally every character from Guy's team fight against each opponent they were set up to, mainly Kisami's water clones and later on their actual clones. It would have just unnecessarily dragged the game out, so thanks for that. But there are 2 things about Storm 2 that makes it so experiencing the arc shared by Ultimate Ninja 5 actually worth it. For starters, the animation is obviously better for the same reason Storm 1 was such a visual achievement. The character designs are marvelous. I actually think Naruto looks better here than in the anime, which is more noticeable during battles since the cutscenes can get a bit stiffy at times, though they still look pretty good. And Ultimate Ninja 5, well, look, I don't want to begrudge them. It's a goddamn PS2 game. They did their best, but they couldn't really do much to not just Naruto, but for every character, sort of like reach the same visual refinement from the anime. And because both games attempt to be story driven and patient with dialogue, it was a lot important for Storm 2 to be so good looking. Also, while I won't defend the lip syncing too much because it tends to be inconsistent with what they're saying a lot of the times, it's definitely better than the one in Ultimate Ninja 5. There are times when the mouth movements look like fucking South Park. But you know what, even if I don't compare this to Ultimate Ninja 5, I would still think it's visually good. There are so many stimulating shots like Naruto's angry response to Chiyo, Deidara getting triggered by Sasuke, Shizune when she ran towards the door in desperation as she wanted to report Gaara getting kidnapped by the Akatsuki, the fucking opening scene of the game after Pain had launched a Shinra Tensei attack to Konoha. And notice how I've only talked about either pre or post battle scenes because if we're talking about the fights themselves, we need to talk about the boss battles and how marvelous they are. Everything I loved about the battles against Manda, Gamabunta, and Shukaku were present there. Mainly the cinematic quick time events, except it was even better here because now they're faster, more abundant, and they're not exclusive to these big fucking monsters you have to deal with. And granted, most of the boss battles do have segments where you eventually have to fight against a more intimidating version of your opponent from a long distance while dodging pretty powerful and wide long range attacks. But unlike in the first game, you're not just subjected to that. Both during regular combat and after damaging your opponent enough times that the quick time events commence, you don't have to deal with some crazy giant ass God of War like bad guy. A lot of the times you're confronting someone relative to your size and I guess also strength, though to a lesser extent, which is neat. And the shit that happens there, like dude, I don't know what to say to you. I'm just gonna say that when Chiyo used one of her puppets to fucking like turbo rape one of Sasuke's puppets, it made me respect her even more than I already did. I also really like it when normal physical movements are involved, mainly when you have to dodge attacks. It just gives this kinetic and intense vibe to those fights. Speaking of dodges, let's talk about Naruto vs Sasuke. Now before I talk about the fight as a whole, I really want to point out just one particular scene. One scene that pretty much explains why I love these boss battles. Something I wish the Storm games had put more effort into is the defense system, because all you have to do to avoid attacks is either shield yourself with guard or substitution. There aren't any like hand-to-hand defensive moves, which I feel like is something really important that adds to the energy of the fights in the anime. But unfortunately the Storm games didn't do much to maximize this aspect during battles, which whatever, that's fine I guess. But thankfully boss battles can do something about this issue. And this scene alone does exactly what I wish to see. Fucking excellent, dude. As for the fight itself, what can I say? It was perfect. Now bear in mind, this was not the most accurate portrayal of their reunion. I mean sure, none of the boss battles are entirely faithful to the source material, but this fight was really not accurate. Though I don't really care, to be honest. I like the fact that it took place in Orochimaru's hideout before it got destroyed, because I played Ultimate Ninja 5 before I even began to consider reading Naruto, so I associate that fight with that stage a lot more. It just wouldn't be the same without Sasuke standing on top of that snake statue and that creepy atmosphere that's absent when the hideout is destroyed. I love the callback to the Valley of the End battle, especially because it required them to feature characters that were gone in free battle. I like the color filter added to those flashbacks, same one used during Secret Factors. It was just overall an awesome battle. Another really cool boss battle was the one with Kakuzu. Now there's a very specific reason for why that fight is special to me, and to explain why, I have to explain the context of it. You see, at the time, Naruto was going through a sort of a rough patch. He failed to defeat Deidara, almost lost Gaara, and got humiliated by Sasuke's overwhelming advantage in strength. It seemed like all the time he spent training with Jiraiya wasn't really paying off. He decided to learn a new jutsu, and when it came to his encounter with Kakuzu, he had to finally prove to himself that he can have a moment of victory. And I don't know if the developers did this on purpose, but for some reason, the battle was way harder than the previous ones. Now initially, it didn't really seem that difficult, but once Kakuzu reached the phase where he attached himself to those trees, he became an overpowered monster. The first time I played Storm 2, I had to retry so many fucking times because he was really hard to deal with. Now, I will say that when I revisited the game for this review, it wasn't as difficult to fight against him, and I actually succeeded on first try, but I'm pretty sure it's only because I eventually internalized Kakuzu's patterns because of how many times I had to restart. Also, I'm a much better and smarter player than I was before. Even then, I still thought this boss battle was harder and, if I'm not mistaken, longer than the previous ones. And because of this, the first time I played this game, I ended up resonating with Naruto a lot more because I was thirsty for some victory after so many defeats. Exactly how Naruto felt. Now, I don't know if the decision to make it harder was meant to elicit this exact emotion I felt, or it was completely unintentional. It was just simply a natural increase of the difficulty, much like in any other game. But regardless, it made me feel the way I did, and I love it. But let's look at the big guns, aka the arcs about Sasuke vs Itachi and later Naruto vs Pain. Honestly, in regards to Itachi, there isn't much to say. They did a great job adapting that moment in the story, really great atmosphere created. When the boss battle ended, they decided not to play the victory song, reasonably so because that song is too lighthearted and not very appropriate for the context of the event. They did the same thing when Jiraiya was done fighting Pain, and that instance was even more trivial to not have any song at all just so we can have a moment of silence. There was some good music, especially the one that played during flashback scenes when Itachi and Sasuke were younger and in good terms. That song was emotionally powerful, and when they played it during the twist, it was even more effective. There was also that instance where Itachi with his Susanoo was slowly pressuring Sasuke to the wall, with both of them completely drained of stamina and chakra, and I love how I could feel that for myself as I was controlling Sasuke, and not only could I not use any chakra, my punches were embarrassingly weak and ineffective. It was a really cool and new thing they did, and then when we get to the fight between Jiraiya and Pain, well, they kind of did it again. Can I just first mention how fucking gut-wrenching it was to witness the last conversation between Tsunade and Jiraiya, because aside from the fact it was a heartbreaking scene, there was a certain point in the music where it plays the same heartbreaking melody present in He Who Howls and Rages, which is the score that plays during the fight between Naruto and Pain. And don't worry, I have a couple of more points to add related to that song in specific, but yeah, this is another example of melodies associated with a specific person or emotion being reused effectively. This same score was later played when Jiraiya was reminiscing of his time with Nagato, Yahiko, and Konan, and also when his death was reported, though while we're on the subject of music, I can't tell if this was deliberate or an error, but for some reason they replaced the sorrowful song that played during Jiraiya's last brawl before he died with something slightly less depressing and also with a sort of actiony beat. At first I was really confused and thought that maybe my memory was a bit loose, so I checked a couple of Let's Plays, and as far as the previous consoles, the song was exactly as I remember. And then I checked walkthroughs of Legacy, and yeah, this replacement is present in all of the copies of the current consoles, at least for the PlayStation 4, and yeah, I was not a fan of this decision. I associate Jiraiya's death with lightless struggle, so the fact that it was removed in the remaster was not only baffling but really damaging. But you know what, fuck it, I still love the boss battle with Jiraiya. In his last breathing seconds, I just felt so hopeless and powerless. None of my attacks were doing anything, I couldn't move very well because I was injured, and the more I was getting hit, I wasn't just losing a typical battle, but instead I was dying canonically. They even have the fucking nerve to show my health bar getting drained as the paths of pain were killing me. Now that is just psychotic. And that last Rasengan blow was just so visually stunning. At that point, I was convinced that the game could not make me feel for Jiraiya's death more than they already did, until Naruto heard the news. I really like how immediately after he was told, the scene was being presented through a weird angle that makes you feel kind of unease. Following this reveal, the game actually allowed you to experience the depressing walks that Naruto took in the manga. It's a lot more effective when you're already familiar with the streets of Konoha, the light-hearted music that always plays in the background, and the natural way Naruto walks and runs, which makes Naruto's slow walk with his head tilted down and a tear-jerking song playing as you mope around a lot more impactful. I'm also glad they didn't force you to walk literally every step of the area, since it would probably drag the scene out, so instead they would fade to the next area around halfway through. Really well executed death. They did a lot of justice to both Jiraiya and Naruto. As for Pain's invasion, there's not much I have to say other than the fact that I'm glad the sky looked cloudy and gloomier than if you were to watch the anime, which I feel like adds to the atmosphere a lot more. Though where I really want to touch on is Sage Mode Naruto and how fucking incredible he is. I love how he beats his opponents in multiple directions thanks to his shadow clones, and depending on where you're aiming the analog, he can launch Pain to the air like he did with that fucking rhinoceros, or how you can slam Pain to the ground like he did to one of the Paths of Pain when he was defending Tsunade, or how about the fact that when he's standing still, he's crossing his hands like he did during his entrance. Like, dude, playing with Sage Mode Naruto is like one of the most gratifying things in the world. Anyway, the boss battle against Pain was pretty great with nice build up, very emotional BGM. I just admire how Chikayo Fukuda doesn't shy away from composing music that doesn't have to be super actiony. The song has no beat and it's made up of mostly piano and violin. And honestly, I've been listening to this song ever since I heard it in like Storm Generations demo, I think around 2012, and ever since it just never stops playing in my head. Now I would call this boss battle perfect, but there's one major hole, and that is Hinata. She came to help Naruto but never actually got to directly confront Pain. All she did was prevent Naruto from getting stabbed, which don't get me wrong, that was a good deed, but I wanted to fucking see her fight against Pain with her twin lion fists, exactly how she did in the anime. It doesn't seem impossible for them to do it. There have been times when characters in your control doing boss battles were switched, like how later on in round 3 we were initially controlling Sage Mode Naruto, but then after a certain attack it switched back to regular Naruto, so why didn't they let me fight with Hinata? I don't know, they probably didn't see it as much of a necessity, but for me personally, Hinata's presence played a huge role in my enjoyment of that whole spar with Pain, so the fact that they didn't do much with her was pretty disappointing. But following all of this was more excellent adaptation of the Pain Assault arc, as we see his last conversation with Nagato, and one of my favorite soundtracks in the game, The Way of Peace, was being played. The celebration scene was really well handled, and during the credits, they actually animated the cover of Volume 42. Now this is a fucking dope ass game. Oh yeah, they referenced Aoi from Ultimate Ninja 4, which was fine, though I probably would have liked it more if she actually made an appearance. Seeing her design with better graphics would have been pretty cool. But hey, we're talking about a character from a filler arc that, if I'm being honest, I'm probably the only one who actually cares for her, so I kinda don't blame them for not fixating on her to this extent. Anyway, Storm 2, if you couldn't tell, it's a good game. I recommend it.
お前にとって俺は兄弟子。同じ死を仰いだ者同士、理解し合えるはずだが、死は平和を望んでいた。木を見て森を見ていない。お前には平和の本当の意味が理解できてないだけだ。
この忍びの世には憎しみがはびこっている。
どの忍びも憎しみと戦っている。
だがいつかは本当に理解し合える時代が来るとわしは信じとる。
ナルト、俺はお前を信じている。
俺は絶対諦めねえ。最後の最後まで俺はずっとお前が掴み返すまでこの手を伸ばし続けてやる。 そしてまたみんなで一緒に。
Look, I don't know what to say to you. Storm 3 is a goddamn masterpiece. Like, okay, before I start talking about things exclusive to this game, let me first clarify a couple of things. Storm 3 may be a sequel to Storm 2, but Generations technically came before this, so as a result, there are certain improvements present here that actually originated from Generations, like substitution jutsu. Now you don't have to fucking click the defense button who knows how many times before the substitution decides to work, because it used to be that the timing was super strict. Thanks to Generations, substitution jutsu has its own separate button, namely L2, and it's like the field of effect got bigger. It's just a lot easier and effective to use, and it doesn't rely on a chakra supply anymore. It has its own separate bar, and you can only substitute yourself 4 times at once before it eventually recharges, which was a pretty nice addition. I'll eventually elaborate more on this topic when I talk about Storm 4 in the future, but this was one of the first few steps that led to the Storm franchise being more strategic than how it initially was. Although they gave the character selection menu a different self-contained track, which is fine, though I didn't really like it very much, and it's no different in Storm Generations and Revolution. The one from Storm 4 is pretty cool though. You can also cancel combos by chakra dashing. That way you can either restart and inflict more damage, or if you want to just stop and move out of the way, you do exactly that. Unlike before, when the moment you stop attacking, you are pretty much dead. We have a few new stages that honestly should have been present in the first 2 storms, like the Great Naruto Bridge or Orochimaru's hideout when it got destroyed, and inside the hotel was Sasuke fought Itachi. Oh, and speaking of the Great Naruto Bridge, I can play with my good pals Haku and Zabuza. Part 1 characters are available in free battle, and let me take advantage of this opportunity to talk about PTS Hinata. Now look, I know I kind of shat on her in my video talking about the PS2 games, but in Storm she's actually not that bad. While her attacks aren't very potent, she's very flexible and has pretty good hand-to-hand moves. Although, one thing particularly inconvenient about her used to be her ultimate jutsu. She had to be super close to her opponent in order to reach him and pull off her stunt, and Storm 1 had this thing where the setup for ultimates occurred in the middle of the battle without freezing time right after clicking circle like in the later games, so it was practically impossible to catch someone with her ultimate because they were either nowhere near her, or maybe they were, but they would attack her or move out of the way while she was setting up the ultimate. And it doesn't help that Storm 1 was slower at responding to your commands. Storm 3 doesn't have those problems, and just to make things more convenient, she can actually catch her opponent in slightly longer distances, so that's cool. Although I really wish they'd use her second ninjutsu from Storm 1 as her main one in Storm 3, because the one she has is kinda lame. They added friendly tournaments, survival, and exclusively for Storm 3 challenge missions that'll give you an excuse to kill time by playing against CPU or real life friends when it comes to tournaments. Not even Ultimate Ninja 5 contained tournaments if I'm not mistaken. As for features Storm 3 introduced, there are a couple, like how you can perform ultimate jutsu even when your opponent is awakened. Also, if the ultimate jutsu is the fatal blow, there are short finishing scenes before the matches are over that show up, inspired by the secret factors from Storm 2. I really like this feature. I think it puts more life into those fights even if you're just playing friendlies. But I guess the most notable addition is how Awakening works, because it used to be that you can only activate it after you lost a certain amount of health, but now there are some characters who can activate it pretty much whenever they want, though it's gonna drain not just your chakra but the capacity as well, at least temporarily, and in some cases it costs your health. I thought this was a smart move because this idea of awakening after your health is low enough makes a lot of sense, but only applies to several characters. I mean, Naruto for example should technically activate his KCM mode whenever he wants, same with the Byakugan and Flying Raijin. Also, by the way, when you're awakened, some characters can pull off some cool feats by clicking either L1 or R1. Now unfortunately they removed 4th combo, which kinda felt like a stab in the balls to be honest. I guess I should also point out that Storm 3 was when the series, at least when it came to free battle in specific, started to suffer from a bit of stagnation. Yeah, they added a couple of new characters, some of the existing ones getting new feats, but the mode didn't really seem like it was evolving drastically enough from Storm Generations. Most of the pre-existing characters have the exact same moveset, and the overall gameplay didn't seem different enough that it felt like you were playing a completely different game. Now I'm not saying free battle in Storm 3 got stagnant, I'm just saying it was the first Storm game that started to show traces of stagnation. The experience in free battle is still different enough from the previous games that it won't just feel like you're playing Generations again, but it's still worth noting this because it was something I sort of felt. I mean, notice how many of the stages have the same music present in the previous games. Back in the PS2 era, there was more effort put into updating the music in the battle arenas, and while yes, they did have a habit of recycling scores, especially in the later titles, they still at least tried to add more variety. And with the Storm games, well, it kind of felt like that when the second game was released. Training Field, Forest of Death, Valley of the End, they had different scores, but then they never bothered to change what they had previously established, and now, well, we're here. But I guess if we have to discuss where Storm 3 shines the most, it would be the story mode, because without a doubt, this game has the best story mode in any of the Ultimate Ninja games. Yes, it's better than Storm 2 and 4. Now let me make something clear, when I say it has the best story mode, that's not to say it has the best story adapted. In fact, Storm 3 covers a point in Naruto that I don't like nearly as much as the previous arcs. I'm specifically referring to the time Naruto met B until Madara showed up. This portion of the story felt like a bit of a drag, at least when reading the manga, which makes it even more admirable the fact that this game didn't allow this obstacle to keep them from standing above all of the Ultimate Ninja games when it comes to story. From the very beginning, you could already tell we were in for a treat, as they started off the game by adapting the Nine Tails incident that led to the 4th Hokage's death. Now, depending on which choice you make, oh by the way, this game occasionally forces you to make a choice between legend or hero, which alters your trajectory, though not significantly. Anyway, depending on which choice you'll make, you'll either first fight against the Masked Man or the Nine Tails. I recommend the Nine Tails just like in the demo, and man, that fight was so epic. The village all burning and being destroyed, the dark atmosphere, Hiruzen being a fucking badass, encouraging his fellow shinobi to risk their lives and protect the village, the music, oh my god, the burning leaf. This is probably my favorite song in all of the Ultimate Ninja games, all of them. It's so epic, exhilarating, different than any other track in the Storm games, and the inclusion of vocals was perfect. There was also a lot of really cool moments that happened here, like when Shikaku, Inoichi, and Choza contributed to the fight, which kind of served as foreshadowing for some of the events later on, and around the end of the battle when the Nine Tails held back a little bit after taking some damage, and Hiruzen continued to fight as he was bleeding. Oh, that's another thing, there's blood now. You can activate violent imagery in options, though I'm not sure if by deactivating it you censor the blood during story mode because I haven't tried turning it off. All I know is that affect the matches, though the addition of blood during battles is pretty minimal and you basically won't even notice. Story mode is where you really start to notice the inclusion of it. I would also like to briefly highlight how perfect the Flying Raijin level 2 scene was, and Darkness Captures the Flash is another one of my favorite tracks in the game. The music in this game is generally just so good. But you know what's even better? The fact that they finally fixed one of my biggest pet peeves with this franchise. If you've seen my video covering the PS2 games, then you might remember me pointing out that I hated how the game forced me to click X to forward the dialogue, and I don't want to focus on this issue too much, so I'd just like to say that Storm 3 fixed this problem, well, sort of. You see, now during cutscenes the dialogue forwards itself, although Storm 1 did technically do this first, but the difference is that Storm 3 has more cutscenes than Storm 1, although there are times when they switch to manual dialogue, but it usually happens when a conversation is taking place in the open world setting, and generally they don't take that long. Not to mention, pretty much every battle has dialogue, which before it used to be that there were only a few instances exclusively doing boss battles where characters would talk to each other during their wrestle, but now it seems to be that every battle, including non-boss ones, features some level of dialogue, which is pretty neat because it makes it so those fights feel less like regular matches specifically fabricated to be part of the storyline, and now they feel more like they're naturally a part of Ultimate Adventure. In other words, it's easier to make the distinction between friendly battles and non-boss battles, which adds a lot to the immersion. I would also like to point out that the animation during cutscenes improves in Storm 2, the facial and body expressions were tightened up, the scene directing was upgraded. Just check out Gaara's speech to the whole shinobi force from a multitude of villages, and the lip syncing got a lot better, which I'm really glad because that was a bit of an annoyance in the previous game, But I have to admit one thing, Storm 2 had generally better boss battles. That's not to say that Storm 3 didn't have boss battles that were on par or even superior to the ones from its predecessor. But Storm 2 was a lot more consistent at making these grandeur fights in which every single one of them felt like the final level of the game. Storm 3 has several boss battles that feel relatively low-key and, at least when compared to Storm 2, a bit uneventful. Even the fight between Minato and the Masked Man, despite the fact that I really liked it, it's also a good example of what I'm talking about. Not much really happened there. Now, I don't necessarily see this as a problem. I'm fine with some boss battles being a bit low-key. I'm just saying I have to give credit to Storm 2 for being consistent with its spectacle. Although something very interesting that the third game did was the revival of Ultimate Jutsu. In case you don't know what I'm talking about, in Storm 2 you can't activate Ultimate Jutsu during boss battles. Now, I'm not sure why this decision was made, but whether it was intentionally or not, there was some benefit to it, which was the fact that some boss battles were adapting a point in the story where Naruto, Sasuke, or whoever the fuck were about to use a certain technique either for the first time or just simply for a special occasion, like when Sasuke used Karen against Itachi or when Naruto killed Kakuzu with his Rasen Shuriken. And if we were allowed to use these trump cards even before we would eventually use them during the quick time events, it would rob the impact of those attacks. Now, if this was the reason why, or at least one of the reasons, I wouldn't be surprised since Storm 2 seemed to have a decent amount of care for the continuity, evident by how he could almost never awaken with Naruto, and they separated him into 3 different versions in order to complement the timeline. Also, I wish Storm 1 did the same thing when it came to awakening. Storm 3, on the other hand, gave us the ability to use Ultimate Jutsu, well, just for a couple of occasions. Sometimes they restrict you from using it, but still, I guess they realized this was too much of a valuable thing for players to permanently lose during every boss battle, even when it wasn't always necessary to remove it. One thing they did that was pretty challenging was trying to work with KCM Naruto, because he's not really a selectable character. You had to be awakened in order to access him, but in Ultimate Adventure, because there were various points in the story where Naruto was fighting permanently in his KCM form, they must have realized that they had to keep him in his KCM state as if it were an independent character. They did pretty much the same thing with Toby when he was walking around as Madara. Initially, Naruto's moveset was similar to the one he had in Generations, but after a certain point in the story, his attacks do get upgraded. I'm also going to assume this may have been what inspired them to give KCM to Naruto his own spot as an individual selectable character in Storm Revolution. Either that or they just felt like it was too much of an increased stage of his growth that only allowing him to access it when he's awakened would be a bit unfair. Now, if we're going to talk about the free roam design and mechanics, well, all I can say is that it's not super different from Storm 2. It's definitely better since it's bigger, there are new camera angles, including instances where it automatically switches angles in the same location. There's more detail put into the background of the areas if you pay close enough attention. Naruto shouts more often when he jumps, but at the end of the day, I don't think there's a major change between the previous and the current title. You'll mostly just appreciate the fact that you're running and traveling through areas that look identical to the ones you're familiar with, like how Konoha is going through reconstruction after Pain's invasion. I guess there's also that thing with the whole hero and legend where you can evolve. If you choose either of them, you gain more points, and you can also revisit certain battles from the past, but Nevertheless, there are still some things this game did that Storm 2 never got the chance to do. When Sasuke decided to attack the 5 Kage and go after Danzo, in the manga he had to deal with a bunch of ninja going after him, and in this game they actually allowed us to experience that and kill all of them, and I'm really glad because this was a special moment for him. The Ultimate Ninja games have a history of making us fight against a bunch of meaningless henchmen, specifically Ultimate Ninja 4, 5, Heroes 3, and Impact. I've never been much of a fan of those periods because they felt like a drag. The henchmen themselves didn't feel that special to play against, it would quickly get pretty repetitive and it just felt like I was wasting my time. But how Storm 3 went about it was genius because aside from the fact that they don't go overboard with its frequency, they're also meant to adapt confrontations that actually occur in the manga, and they added some fun ways of finishing off your opponents more efficiently. Or hell, when I played with Darui, I didn't even have to defeat all of the white Zetsus. I mainly had to defeat Kakuzu and eventually Kikaku and Gikaku. There are also cases where it's not just that you're fighting against meaningless henchmen, but You're actually confronting a multitude of pretty important characters, like when Naruto fight against the 6th Jinchuriki. Now, talking about why Storm 3 works so much is a bit hard, simply because in doing so, I would essentially be repeating myself, because if you know why Storm 2 works so well, then you'll know exactly why this game works as well. Awesome boss battles with stunning visuals, perfect adaptation of the story that's based on decent presentation. So instead, I'm just gonna be a little pickier and talk about moments that succeeded in ways that are unique to this game, at least the ones I care about. Number 1, literally everything about Minato and Kushina. I was shocked by how patient they were when it came to telling the story of how Naruto was born. They had the decency of having certain scenes communicated through free roaming, seeing the village one more time before it got destroyed back when Naruto's parents were still alive was so intriguing. Kushina walks pretty slow and calmly, which sort of adds to the peaceful atmosphere created by the music and the narrative context. But the moment that really got to me was this completely original scene where after Minato left the apartment to fight against the Nine Tails, at the time Kushina was absolutely exhausted because for one, she gave birth to a child, 2, she experienced high amounts of stress after this guy from out of nowhere threatens to kill her baby, and 3, she had the Nine Tails extracted from her body, which according to many sources, having a tail beast extracted from your body generally leaves the former host dead, so technically Kushina should have been deceased. While the Nine Tails was causing earth shakes, creating havoc, and all in all wrecking the village, baby Naruto was crying like shit, and as Kushina was thinking of a way of calming him down, she remembers this toy Minato bought way before Naruto was even born, and in spite of how exhausted she was, she stood up and tried her best to calm Naruto down by picking that toy up and cooling him. It was a really long scene, but effectively long because it emphasized just how drained she was and was struggling to even move a single muscle, but she still cared so much for her son that she faced the physical hassle. It was without a doubt a very emotional scene, and it helps that the song Mother's Love was being played because that song emotionally abuses me. Everything about their backstory and how it was handled was just so powerful and hard-hitting. You're not going to finish watching their death without having the urge to shed some tears, especially with the high-quality voice acting present there. Moving on, being even more specific, after Kakashi beats Zabuza, a bit of blood fell on Haku's right eye in a way that looked like a teardrop. Similar thing happened to Zabuza when he got defeated, which I thought it looked cool. I like the war environment build up throughout the game, like when the Shinobi Alliance established a facility where they could discuss, create, and follow their operations, and the way the menu was presented, as in how you observe the progress of their operations, was pretty dope. It also gave me the opportunity to play with characters I probably would never pick in friendly battles like Darui and Mifune, and they were pretty fun to play with. Madara's fight against the Shinobi Alliance was really trippy, complex, and exciting. It was an insanely colorful fight, which also served to show exactly what we would get in Storm 4, since that game took the colorfulness to a whole new level. Naruto's speed blitzing the Fort Raikage was animated spectacularly, much better animated than in the anime, which, speaking of which, this is another thing that Storm Generations technically did first, but remember that time Naruto hit Gaara with his 2000 clones? So that whole combo is present here as an ultimate, and it's animated much better than in the anime. They actually showed the clones physically moving their bodies to kick Gaara's ass. But getting back on topic, the only thing about story mode that left me unsettled was the ending. Now I kind of understand why they ended the way they did. If the story had ended with the war still continuing, then they wouldn't have any excuse to continue doing side missions, collecting items, and other things you can do during free roaming. So they had to find a way to make not only Naruto return to the village, but also leave everyone not occupied so that you can interact with them. But even then, it still felt awkward. Also, I recommend buying full births because if you don't, you're not going to be able to experience the fight between Itachi and Kabuto, and that's a pretty important one. But in the end, it was a well-told, well-presented, and faithful video game that deserves credit for being an example of how masterful story-driven anime games can be. Okay, just one more thing, when Naruto used his fucking kunai to block Sasuke's blade, like dude, that was pretty fucking badass. This is like the millionth time I'm gonna reference my video talking about the PS2 games, sorry. But in there I said that Ultimate Ninja 3 had my least favorite soundtrack, Looking back, I feel literally the exact opposite. Aside from the fact that it has pretty memorable scores, I just missed the traditional vibe the PS2 games had that the Storm games have been steering away from. Songs like the one that played during Heroes History is just not one you can easily find anymore, which I feel like is one of the few fields where I think the PS2 games executed better than the Storm games, because funny enough, when I first planned to write this review, I admittedly expected to be very critical of the Storm games and point out just how the PS2 games handle certain gameplay aspects better, because I guess when I revisited Ultimate Ninja 3, 4, and 5, I was so impressed by what you could do there that you couldn't really do when you looked at the following generation. But now, when I look at things more clearly, I just can't really put myself in a position where I say that the original Ultimate Ninja games are more fun, because in truth, they're not. CyberConnect 2 really upped their game, and while I would still get pissy whenever they would remove certain features, I would also respect them for how much they push to make their games feel closer at capturing the spirit of the series, based on how fast, faithful, and carefully put together their fights are. I mean, I could probably spend another hour just pointing out how the techniques and combos are so reminiscent of Naruto. Name a single game that does better dashes than Ultimate Ninja. Name a single game that replicates scenes from Naruto better than this. Like, dude, when fucking Naruto activates his KCM mode, the brief cutscene that plays after successfully awakening is exactly the same shot when he entered his QB Chakra mode after defeating Kurama. Look at how fucking fast and rich Sasuke's melee combos are. The Storm games aren't by any means the most complex and competitive games I've ever played. In fact, they don't even excel at that in the realm of Naruto games. The Gekido Ninja Taisen series would probably take the title for that. But they're very gratifying to play given their excellent fan service and flashy audiovisual presentation. Storm made me raise my bar for how licensed anime games can be aesthetically modeled and animated, to the point where there are a handful of games that, admittedly to an unreasonable extent, I struggle to take them seriously because I know how far anime games can look, and honestly, I respect this franchise for that.
"ずっと聞きそびれてたけど、なぜ君は彼をそこまで気に入ってるんだい?"
あの子には夢を乗せてるから。
夢?
いつか私たちに子供ができたら、あの子のように明るくまっすぐに歩いていける、そんな子に育ってほしいと思う。決して頭が良くなくていい、生意気でもいいけど、仲間を大事にして根性があって、決して意志を曲げない、そんな強い子になってほしいって。
この世界は終わらせねえ。
終わらせる。